I've always been fascinated by William Lane Craig. He has the most amazingly articulate and confident way of saying the dumbest things, which gets me wondering, does he do this on purpose? Does he act stupid in a willful attempt to manipulate and fast-talk his audience? Or is there really just a huge gap between his command of the English language and his basic reasoning skills? Join me as I explore these questions, taking a tour of Craig's arguments in a segment I call William Lane Craig, Idiot or Willful Piece of Today we're going to watch how Craig behaves toward a student during a question and answer session. Let's get right to it, shall we?
Hi. There's a lot of talk about the burden of proof, and I just wanted to point out firstly that you cannot prove the non-existence of a thing, and naturalists accept this. But the problem is when you invoke God as an explanation for that, what you're doing is you're invoking something that is inherently inexplicable. Thereby, you're not solving the problem, you're not explaining anything, you're confounding the problem. You have more to explain. And I just want to ask you, do you think that invoking God as a hypothesis about natural things or the origin of life or the origin of the universe, you think that's an advancement to knowledge?
Before getting into Craig's response, let's catalog what this student just said. First, he said that you can't prove a thing does not exist. Second, he said that if you invoke God to explain things, all you do is bring up more questions. And finally, he asked if using God as an answer to anything can advance knowledge. These seem to me like pretty reasonable and thoughtful points. So let's see how Craig handles them.
Now, repeat the first part of the question again, because I disagreed with what you said there.
It is impossible to prove
the
non-existence.
It's impossible to prove something does not exist. That's silly. Of course you can prove something does not exist. We can prove, for example, that there are no living Tyrannosaurus Rex on the face of the earth. We can prove that there are no Muslims of the United States Senate. Or, as Dr. Shook says, if you can show that something is a self-contradiction, he's in the House. Yeah. You can show that something is self-contradictory. So there are no married bachelors.
Now this just looks like a brazenly asshole move by Craig. Given that he has any competence whatsoever as a philosopher, he knows very well what this student means about not being able to prove a negative. He knows what an unfalsifiable claim is, and he knows the conditions under which a negative can be impossible to prove. Thus he had to have grasped the impossibility of demonstrating that an invisible, immaterial being doesn't exist at any point within or even outside the entire universe. This is really basic philosophical stuff. But instead of taking the point seriously, Craig deflected to ridiculous counterexamples of how you can prove that physical beings with known properties don't exist within a limited area, which is just childish. Even the most amateur armchair philosopher knows the difference between falsifying the claim that a Muslim is in the Senate and falsifying the claim that a God exists anywhere. And by equating the two, Craig is basically flipping the student the bird and ignoring his point.
You can show that something is self-contradictory. So there are no married bachelors. So this is an atheist line that you hear on a popular level all the time, but that sophisticated atheists don't take, because it is easy to prove that things don't exist.
Okay, so this is just a little side thing, but I really hate what Craig just did. If you watch enough of his work, you'll notice that he loves to invent his own personal summaries of the atheistic perspective. And once he grants himself permission to decide what we all think, he can then saddle us with straw man opinions that he easily counters or uses to demonstrate the necessity of Christianity, as he'll do in our next video on objective morality. But in this case, he does something different. Here he uses his fictional idea of a sophisticated atheist consensus to make some kind of twisted appeal to authority. An authority he disagrees with, but can use to dismiss this kid's argument by saying that even his own people would find it pedestrian. Not super duper classy, Bill.
Now the question is, if it is the case that you can't prove that God does not exist, then you shouldn't be a naturalist. you should be some sort of agnostic or something, but you shouldn't go around saying things like, nature is all there is. There is nothing beyond matter and energy. There is no supernatural reality, because those claims exceed what you yourself say you can prove. So you need to make more modest claims about your position that are more simply agnostic or something, and find a new name rather than naturalism, because that isn't something that you can sustain the burden of proof for.
Look, a person can be a naturalist on the grounds that there's no realistic reason to believe in God, while still conceding the philosophical technicality that you can't disprove his existence. This is very reasonable, and Craig knows it. In fact, he himself lives by this same principle in all areas of his life other than Christianity. If someone were to ask him, do aliens regularly visit Earth, or is there usually a basketball floating right behind your head where you can't see it, Craig would probably answer no. And he would have good reason to do so on the grounds that these claims are far-fetched, violate his entire understanding of the world as he's experienced it thus far, and have no positive evidence. Of course, if pressed hard enough, sure, he'd have to acknowledge that he can't provide absolute proof these things aren't true. But we'd be splitting hairs to a juvenile extent if, on this basis, we chastised him for his answer of no and told him to back down to a more modest agnostic claim about them. There's a difference between saying, no, that's not true, in the sense that something's not been proven and you have no reason to believe it, and no, that's not true in the overly literal sense that you've looked everywhere in the universe and can prove in absolute terms that it's false. And expecting someone to unpack that kind of language every time they answer no to a proposition is purposefully obtuse and frankly dick-headed. Unless Craig stopped short of taking Philosophy 101, he knew what this student meant. Yet he chose to ridicule the young man based on a misrepresentation of what it means to disbelieve something.
Now, the last part of your question assumed that I was presenting God as some sort of an explanatory hypothesis. And if you look at my arguments, they're not like that. These are deductive arguments. Now, what that means is that if the premises are true, that the conclusion follows logically and necessarily. Whether you like it or not, whether you think it's explanatory or not, it doesn't matter. All that matters is, are the premises more plausibly true than not? Because if they are, then the conclusion is logically unavoidable. And so, yes, I think they definitely represent an increase in knowledge. This is an example of deductive logical reasoning. And it can't be impugned by saying that it's not some sort of explanatory inference to the best explanation or something of that sort.
So Craig just told this student, and I quote, "Your last question assumed that I was presenting God as an explanatory hypothesis. And if you look at my arguments, they're not like that." But did this student really assume such a thing? Let's replay and see what he said.
But the problem is, when you invoke God as an explanation for that, what you're doing is you're invoking something that is inherently inexplicable. Thereby, you're not solving the problem, you're not explaining anything, you're confounding the problem. You have more to explain. And I just want to ask you, do you think that invoking God as a hypothesis about natural things or the origin of life or the origin of the universe, I think that's an advancement to knowledge?
As we can plainly see, our student did not phrase his question as a critique of Craig's presentation. He was asking a broad question about whether bringing God into the picture helps us explain anything about the universe. And once more, we see Craig choose to derail the conversation, this time by deciding the student had assumed something, chastising him for it, and then defending his own arguments against accusations the student had never made. But perhaps the most infuriating thing about this is that Craig is guilty of the very thing he gets irritated with the student for assuming, because he does offer his arguments as explanatory hypotheses. His first cause argument offers God as an explanatory hypothesis for where the universe came from. His moral argument offers God as an explanatory hypothesis for why, in his mind, there's an objective standard of morality. His fine-tuning argument offers God as an explanatory hypothesis for why the universe operates according to coherent physical laws and can support life. Even if he wants to cast his works as deductive constructions used to demonstrate God, most of them do so by demonstrating that parts of the universe are inexplicable and that God explains them. So you, William Lane Craig. You got on a student's case for accusing you of something he never accused you of, when it was something you were doing anyway. So let's get back to our original question in light of what we just saw. Feel free to offer any answers or insights in the comments section. When William Lane Craig refused to discuss a student's valid point about falsifiability, instead bringing up the obvious fact that you can prove physical things don't exist within a specific area, was he being an idiot, or was he willfully being a piece of shit? When William Lane Craig reached into his ass and pulled out a made-up summary of what all smart atheists say, then used this to imply that a student was one of the simple-minded ones, was he being an idiot, or was he willfully being a piece of shit? When William Lane Craig dictated that a student should only be a naturalist if he could conclusively disprove God, was he being an idiot, or was he willfully being a piece of shit? And finally, when William Lane Craig belittled a student for assuming something he hadn't assumed, but that Craig was doing anyway, was he being an idiot, or was he willfully being a piece of shit? I look forward to your feedback. Note, the title of this video does not imply that Craig as a person is either an idiot or a willful piece of shit. Rather, it's asking whether he's momentarily being an idiot or a willful piece of shit when he says certain things. Legally, the phrase willful piece of shit does not accuse Craig of any specific action and is thus not slanderous.